Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon Larouche for Thursday, March 31st. Well, there are many things going on, and we are here and assembled to talk about not merely what's happening, but what we're going to do about it. This week, there's a lot that has happened. We've released this week a Schiller Institute policy document called the Larouche Plan for a New International Economic Architecture. This is important because everybody keeps talking about a new security architecture or what kind of treaties and negotiations should be happening in war. But unless there is a proposal for what's going to actually be done with the world's economies, that's an impossibility. You cannot solve the problem that we have entered into. Matter of fact, all you're going to do is to exacerbate the problem. So what we've done is to release this document, which is intended to really start a discussion, which in itself also references things that we've written over the past 8 years in particular with respect to what people know or have heard as the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, a lot of times, of course, in contemporary society, people use terms and don't know or have any idea what these terms refer to. And so in the case of this Belt and Road Initiative that was announced by China some years ago, what's not known is that itself is a product of a much more extensive discussion that went back 30 years, in which this organization and its members in particular were very involved, not merely with respect to China, but with respect to many other nations in the world. And portions of that program were adopted, but the entirety, the overall conceptual backdrop or underpinning of that program is still essentially owned by us. And therefore, what we're doing is we're trying to put forward the conceptual kernel of that program for the United States and for the nations of the transatlantic world to adopt as the appropriate perspective from which or position from which to begin to think about negotiating or discussing things, whether you're discussing them with Russia or with India or with China or other nations that are committed not to Malthusianism, as has happened culturally in the transatlantic world, but to the growth, development, and prosperity of humanity. So that's the first thing. So it's called the Larouche Plan for a New International Economic Architecture. Second thing is that in 9 days, on Saturday, April 9th, we'll be having a conference, which is the convoking of a conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. This is also a Schiller Institute meeting, and it will be 3 sessions. It begins at 9 a.m. in the morning on Saturday. That first session will be dealing with a new security architecture in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia and the Bandung Conference. Peace of Westphalia referring to that peace of 1648. The Bandung Conference refers to April 18th of 1955, which is when it began. That will be the first panel. Session 2 will be on economy, and it's called For a New Just World Economic Order, Preventing the Starvation of 1 Billion People. And then the third panel of that day, which is called Development, is the conceptions that are going to be discussed are finally overcoming colonialism and imperialism. Development is a new name for peace, and the need to build a world health system. Let me also note for persons that are either subscribed to EIR or should subscribe that the April 1st issue, which is coming out, is called Finding an Alternative to Thermonuclear Catastrophe, featuring Lyndon Larouche's SDI, the technical side of grand strategy. This is a paper written by Lyndon Larouche, 26 pages length, back in 1996. And as the blurb that advertises it says, this paper was provoked by a lying Wall Street Journal article co-authored by several of the authors and advocates of the incompetent 1980s high frontier ballistic missile defense program that was rejected by President Reagan. And what was accepted by President Reagan was the program that Lyndon Larouche proposed to him, and he adopted as of March 23rd, 1983. That story is still not well known in the United States. It's a story that we want to make sure that we tell, and that therefore we've told it here. And it's a story which, if it were actually known, and if it were actually admitted, and there are people, for example, outside of the United States who are not only aware of it, but have spoken about this, it's only in the United States where the story has been suppressed as to what Lyndon LaRouche did, because what Lyndon LaRouche did, what had it been implemented, would have prevented the present circumstance we presently find ourselves in concerning Russia right now. In terms of this, the danger of war. I'm not talking about the political issues, because in fact, the aggressor in this situation is not in fact Russia, but has been NATO. And going back to the period of February 22nd of 2014, when the government of Ukraine, the elected government, was overthrown through the actions of NATO, specifically Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine by the name of Pyatt. It also it did involve then Vice President Joe Biden, but of course the presidency of Barack Obama. And it was that which occurred in February, which then led to the conflicts that occurred in eastern Ukraine, which began as actual shooting war 8 years ago in the fall of 2014, and has been continuous. That 14,000 people were killed in those conflicts between 2014 and 2022. Just to say. So now we want to get to why we're here, what we're here to discuss. And, a title was given, to tonight's presentation by Bill Jones, which I gave, which involved the idea of the final defeat of Bertrand Russell's thermonuclear utopia. We named Bertrand Russell because we keep making the point that the policies of the United States did not originate in the United States. The policies for regime change, the policies for thermonuclear war, for that matter, did not originate in the United States. They came from Bertrand Russell, who died in 1970, born in 1872, and was a dominant figure, intellectual figure, of British intelligence for many years, and is known for a lot of different things. We're not going to go through and spend a lot of time except to point out that Russell, in 1946, had called for the use of the only thermonuclear weapons that then existed in the world, which were owned by the United States, the use of those weapons against the Soviet Union. Not because there was any need to do that in the sense of a war being required, but as a way of, by using them without provocation, to institute a new form of global empire that the United States would rule and would have announced that it ruled. In one sense, he was merely following the example of what the United States had already done at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where it also did not have to drop those bombs. And so the conception was to sort of make it official that the United States would use these weapons unless everyone in the world decided that they were going to subjugate themselves to a single world order that the United States should establish. And that was written in October of 1946 in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Later on, Russell spoke about this same thing in 1958. And the reason this is significant is, as one writer who wrote about this by the name of David Peterson, he said, later Russell's reputation as a peacemaker of his generation suffered severe damage when, in the early years of the Cold War, Russell signed on as an avid backer of the so-called Baruch Plan. The proposal was billed as a peace officer to the Russians, but it might be better described as a bomb hidden in a care package. Under the plan, Stalin would be given an ultimatum. The Soviets could join an international peace agency and forego developing an H-bomb, but if they refused, Moscow and the other major Russian population centers would be instantly obliterated by a nuclear bombardment. In his defense, Russell told a BBC interviewer, quote, "I thought the Russians would give way, but you can't threaten unless you're prepared to have your bluff called." So I only want to indicate this quickly because the world we're in now is the thermonuclear utopia of Bertrand Russell. This was what Lyndon LaRouche successfully fought against. He got the president of the United States to adopt the policy. The Soviet Union rejected the policy, and this began a process of their self-destruction because of the rejection of that policy. Where we are tonight, and this is what we're going to talk a bit about, is another kind of process of self-destruction in which the United States is undergoing, a kind of Will Smith-like self-destruction, with Biden playing a certain role, railing, ranting, and yelling and screaming. But that is not going to cause the United States to once again become a productive nation, which is a leader in collaboration with other nations for world economic development. That is a pathway the United States could take. But it will not, again, ever be the so-called world hegemon. It will not be the single power dictating to anybody. And by the way, that's not even the nature of the United States. That's merely the United States being subjugated as the junior partner in the Anglo sphere run by British intelligence, the British Crown, and by the City of London. So what we're here to do tonight is to talk about this, talk about specifically the recent February 4th joint statement that was made between China and Russia, why that statement actually provoked the actions of NATO, which in turn have caused this kind of sudden commitment to food shortages, to fuel shortages, to rationing in Europe, etc., and how we can break the grip of this by independent action taken by our forces in tandem with others around the world, but with advocating precisely this LaRouche plan for a new international economic architecture as the beginning of a discussion that allows everybody else who has their own ideas about this to join in a kind of set of symposia that is sort of rolling around the world, starting with our conference on April 9th, to come to a human solution to a problem that threatens everybody. So I've asked Bill Jones to join us tonight. And, Bill does a lot of our work with our, Asia sector, and particularly the China desk. They think people have read his articles. And so Bill's going to take over now and brief us, tell us what's been going on in terms of not just Russia and China, but also how that process can incorporate the United States, how we can help to do that. So, Bill, are you there?
Yes, hello. I'd like to say, Dennis,
can we get a little bit more volume from you, Bill?
Can you tell me now? Can you hear me now?
That's better. That's better.
Dennis may go through some of the statement on here. I'll just, I don't have it in front of me, but just briefly indicate that this was an overall statement of cooperation. It is not an alliance. It's not a military alliance, but it is an agreement on how both of these countries feel the world should move. That is, it should be based on the notion of a multipolar world. That is, you can't have one country calling the shots for everybody. It's in spite of the injustice of that, it's also crazy because you have different cultures, you have different ways of doing things and of looking at things, and somehow you cannot try and impose the will of a single party or the form of government or the form of society that have grown up under certain historical circumstances and think you're going to impose them on another country. We had experience with this. We had with this so-called Arab Spring. Remember how that happened? That led to a lot of war and destruction, and hopefully some people have learned the lesson, but obviously all of the people have not learned it. There was also a general agreement that there would be a push for economic development, that the development of the developing sector, which used to be called the Third World, had to be on the agenda, and that this should be the propelling force for the world economy, using the achievements of science and technology, which should be at the center of economic policy in order to benefit all of mankind. Xi Jinping has used, I think, the very poignant phrase of a community of shared future for mankind. Sometimes that's interpreted as the future of common destiny of mankind. And obviously this indicates a different mindset for the world and for the path forward than what we're seeing today. I think we see the dichotomy of what you have today in two events that did occur over the last 24 or 48 hours. One was the Biden-Zelensky phone call. We don't know a lot of the details on this. What we do know is that Biden promised him, I think it was $30 million more in weapons, and Zelensky, they put out a statement saying, we still haven't gotten as much as we need or as much as we want. You've got this guy running around the world in the Zoom messages to all of the parliaments, portraying himself as the hero of Ukraine. I mean, he's somebody said he has the same role as Che Guevara. Now he's toting a beard. Maybe he thinks he's Che Guevara. But what he's doing, and he's saying, I want peace. But what he's also saying, I want more weapons. You know, I want high-powered stuff. At one point, he even said we should be a nuclear power. We, Ukraine, should be a nuclear power. I mean, this is total insanity. But the press that has been, you know, totally taken over by the British oligarchy, they're portraying him as the man of the hour. But the message that's given is crazy, and Biden is playing fully into it. In fact, Biden is encouraging this stuff. Zelensky wouldn't do these things on his own if he didn't think he had support from high places. Maybe he's not getting as much support as he wants, but he certainly is getting a lot of it. And this is the major problem we're facing. So that's one of the paradigms we see, paradigm leading to war. The other, of course, is a meeting that was held in a town called Tunxi in eastern China, where you had the heads of the foreign ministers of China, Russia, Iran, Turkmenistan, Indonesia, Qatar, and representatives from Afghanistan to discuss the all-important issue that we've been talking about, that Helga has been, talking about it for weeks, in this the terrible situation is created by 20 years of war, that it's going belly up now unless something's done. The U.S. isn't talking about it. They've withdrawn completely. They almost withdrawn completely. I mean, they allegedly, or according to reports, they had a meeting today in addition to what is called the neighboring countries meeting, which include the countries that I mentioned, along with Indonesia and Qatar, which are not neighbors to Afghanistan, but which are important, involved in that importantly. Indonesia, because they're heading up the G20 this year, that's going to be a major discussion. Afghanistan, and the other thing is Qatar has been kind of circulating the point of contact between Western countries and Afghanistan while Afghanistan was closed. Now it's relatively open, but not a lot of people are going there. The Chinese have been very active. And so that they're talking about how do we create this place into a real country and get things moving and build it up economically and prevent mass starvation. And the United States is calling for war, is working for building up military capacity for more war. Why is this happening? Now, there are a lot of reasons that people will look for. One is, it's China's rise. China's becoming a major country, and we can't have that. Or it might be the so-called Russian aggression, but as Dennis mentioned, this is all a hoax. Everybody knew that something was going to happen because of the political situation created by the expansion of NATO. Or they may simply be saying that the U.S. wants to reassert its privileges as, the primus inter pares, as the top dog. But you've got to look deeper than that. I mean, you can explain it from Biden. Biden has a certain British Anglophile profile because he was brought into power by Abel Harriman, who was really kind of the original pro-warrior, but he kind of brought him into Congress and directly, very quickly, into the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because Harriman, I'm sure, saw, him as a continuation of what he tried to accomplish over the will of Roosevelt. Remember, Harriman was in the Roosevelt administration, but Roosevelt was looking for a cooperation with Stalin, and Harriman was trying to stop it. He was warning continually, you can't do this, you can't trust this guy, more so than George Kennan. George Kennan's famous for these papers on containment, but George Kennan was relatively rational compared to this guy Harriman and Biden. But it's not only that, because it infiltrates the entire political, large section of the political elites in the United States, that they're pushing for that. What you have to look at is you have to go back to World War I, or you have to go back to shortly before World War I. What was going on? The British, up until then, for almost 2 centuries, really ruled the world. The sun didn't set on the British Empire. Why? Because they had the Navy, and they could go wherever they wanted, and they could control the seas, and this was their source of power. And because they had that, they controlled international trade, and because they controlled international trade, they also controlled international finance. But at a certain point in time in the 1870s, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck decided to scrap the free trade doctrine and to adopt the American system. And he did that with the support of Americans, with the support of Henry Carey and people around Henry Carey who were advising him to do that. And as soon as he did that, Germany, which had been in relatively dire straits economically, suddenly became this tremendous producer of high technology goods in the world, and putting the British to shame, because Britain didn't have much of an industry, they controlled the trade, but Germany then was really putting them to shame in this. And so there was a lot of discussions going on. And this led to the creation of a little organization by Lord Milner, who was one of the leading lights in those days, called the Coefficients. And he brought together these so-called intellectuals in Britain to discuss the question, how do we save the British Empire now that the British Navy no longer controls the world? And in this coefficient were all the people that we learned about, those who read our magazine and our publications over the years. Wells was there, Bertrand Russell was there, Lord Milner, and this character, Halford Mackinder. He's probably not somewhat well known to you guys, although because of the Ukraine crisis, you look in all the military magazines today, and you'll see that he's talking about Halford Mackinder. What's going on in Ukraine? This is the achievement of Halford Mackinder. Who was he? He was actually a biologist, and he was friends of Thomas Huxley. He was also into anthropology, and he saw the world in kind of a biological view. He would compare countries to trees. You have to have trees. You have to separate them, let them grow, all this kind of insanity. But he became a geopolitician. Actually, he created what we call geopolitics. This came out of Mackinder. And what is Mackinder's role? Well, he was looking at this situation as well of, the British, kind of the downfall, the onset of the downfall of the British Empire, says, how do we resolve this situation? And he was looking at the map, and he was a geographer, and he said, well, you look at the map and you see this big area called Eurasia. That's really the center of the world for the most practical parts. It's not the most massive. It is very massive. But if you compare it to Africa and other places, it doesn't look so big. But because so many of the countries that have developed are in Eurasia, that really calls the shots. He says, how do you control this? He said, well, we used to control through the Navy. But what happened now? That Germany was becoming a major industrial power, but also very importantly, Russia, who the British never got along with, were building a railroad called the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And prior to that, of course, they were very long distances. It was hard to get from one place to another over the expanse of Russia, but now it's pretty quick. And it indicated to Mackinder that this is going to become a problem, not only in terms of controlling trade, which then can move by land much more quickly than by sea, but also because the transfer of people from one part of Russia to the next becomes a security problem, and we got to figure out how we're going to deal with this. But Mackinder was also, there was a twofold problem he had to deal with. Germany was becoming a major influence in Europe, major land power in Europe. Again, that would be a problem from controlling by the sea. And Russia as well was becoming very problematic as a major, as biggest land power in Europe. And he came to the conclusion that there's a section between Germany and Russia potentially which could become a bulwark against both of them. That if the British could get control of that particular area, they could play it against the Germans and they could play it against the Russians, and also prevent, which was also a major potential at that time, a German-Russian collaboration, which would really kind of totally eliminate the British. So he said there's this part of Central Europe, this is really the heartland. This is the heartland of Europe, and he had a few documents on this, and he was very active. He wasn't just a scholar sitting in his room looking at the globe. After World War II, he wrote a document in 1904 called The Geographical Pivot of History, in which he first mooted this issue of the heartland. But that's how he became known. He had spent a lot of time in Africa. He was working and trying to help the British gain control of Kenya. He was one of the people that climbed, I can't remember the name of Mount Kilimanjaro or what it was in Kenya. But he went up on the top of that, and it was also kind of a symbolic move by the British to indicate that, yes, we want to control this area too. But this document on the pivot was this center heartland, got the attention of people, and so when World War I happened, the Russian Empire collapsed, and so you had a lot of chaos there in Central Europe, and Germany was at the point of collapse too. So he was sent into Central Europe because he seemed to know something about it, to actually organize this heartland on behalf of the British. And he spent time in Ukraine, he spent time in Poland and all these areas, and he came up with this policy that because the things are so chaotic, you got a lot of different groups moving around here. Ukraine was controlled by what were called the White Russians, which was, the Russian conservatives, but it was also involved the Ukrainian nationalists who were also active at that time. And he came up with this idea that if we pull together Ukraine and Poland, and you've got that, that heartland corridor, which would be used in order to prevent either Germany or either Russia, whoever ends up in the victory. Bolsheviks had not totally taken over. It wasn't secure that they had done that. Whoever was in Russia, you could use this as a corridor, as a bulwark against either of these major powers.
Bill, just hold for a minute. Don't lose your train of thought, because it's going really well. And people, and we are probably going to need it for a transcription. If we can just get either more vibe or clarity. Are you talking on a Bluetooth?
It's a landline. No, it's a landline.
It is a landline. Okay. Well, it's tolerable, but if we can get something slightly better, or it would be better.
Let me try the mobile phone, but that run out of battery after a while. But it'll go for a while.
Here's what somebody just said to me. Hold on. Here's what somebody just said to me. Even if you slow down a little bit and slightly louder, we can deal with it. Okay. So if you want to try the mobile, fine. But it's going. We want to keep following what you're saying. Okay.
You want me to try it? It'd take me a half a minute to get it.
Yeah. Well, no. You know what? Just go ahead. People are giving me all kinds of suggestions. I do not want to interrupt this. And just slow down a little bit, just a little bit, and then give us a more volume if you can. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, good enough. Okay. So what happened was that Mackinder also wrote a document called Democratic Ideals and Reality. And it was a longer document than his 1904 pivot, but it really clearly said, that we have to arrange to create this Central European corridor in order to secure the power, really, for the British Empire, for the West, against Germany and against a revived Germany at that point, or against a Bolshevik Russia. And he did two things. He submitted that to the British Foreign Office, and he also did it really as a document to be read by the negotiators at the Paris Peace Conference. And they did read this, and a lot of this stuff, it was there. He said you have to have the new countries, new democracies, and you'll have this alliance, he called it an alliance of democracies, coming out of the Paris Peace Conference, and that could serve in order to prevent any of the so-called big countries from taking over. And he also, because World War I happened, and the United States didn't go in there, immediately, because there wasn't a lot of interest in that. And when Woodrow Wilson, finally, also a major Anglophile, I mean, he praised the British Parliament. The guy was a ranting racist. A lot of people didn't know that a long time ago, but one of the joys of the Black Lives Matter is a lot of the stuff was rooted out, and Woodrow Wilson, and people discovered, the guy was a racist. We've been talking about him. He's been our hero, but now no longer. So, but that's what he was, and he was also an Anglophile. And when he did go to ask Congress for a declaration of war, there were massive demonstrations outside of the Capitol building, and they even tried to prevent him from entering. I mean, it looks like January 6th, early on, and they didn't succeed in doing that. And he did pass it through. A lot of people, some people were against George Norris, who was famous for the building the Hoover Dam. He was against it, and there were a number of other people. But once it was done, everybody jumped on board, and they became very patriotic. And of course, the World War I, the war to end all wars, that's what it was. But it was basically to jump in on the side of the British. I mean, we didn't do it for France. I mean, people think it was France, and they were overrun. But France and Germany had wars before. During the Franco-Prussian War, General Grant sent Sheridan to the German side to observe the war. We had no big gripe with Germany. We had problems on this stupid submarine decision they made, which was the pretext. But the idea was that we would go to war on the side of the so-called Allies, that is, on the side of the British, which for 200 years had been our sworn enemies. And the Irish, I think, freaked out over this, but, they didn't have much to say about it. And when they did that, of course, Mackinder, as he says in this document, realized that the Americans are on our side, that we've got them under our wing now. And so he presented this paper. And, of course, Wilson had introduced this League of Nations. What was the League of Nations? The League of Nations was really the so-called alliance of democracies. We had the United Nations, completely different. This was just these countries who had so-called won the war, except for Russia. Russia had been on the side of the Allies, but because of the chaos and the revolution, no Russians were there. And this was also, of course, the policy was also directed against them, so it was easy to do. But you had the same kind of countries that, Biden is trying to get together now, against everybody else in the world. Germany is, of course, a part of these now, but this is also aimed against Germany, too. I mean, the German economy is going to go belly up if this policy succeeds, and some people in Germany know that. But, the dynamic is a lot different now. But that was the origin of it. That was this British formulated alliance of democracies to bring in these Eastern European countries against in Russia, but also possibly against Germany unless they would remain subservient. So this was the kind of thing that was going on. And, of course, this is not only a part of history because, but, you know, what they're saying now, this has been a consistent line on the part of the U.S. all during the Cold War. Mackinder was probably forgotten by the 1930s, at least as a major intellectual force. And, of course, when Roosevelt came in, there was a totally different policy. You know, his idea of the post-war period was what the Chinese call today a coalition of the major powers. That is, an alliance, an agreement between major powers. Not as an exclusivist operation, because the United Nations was meant to incorporate all of the peoples, but the major powers should have a more important role because they are powers economically and otherwise, and they can do more, you know, by working together and helping the other countries. So that he had this, you know, notion of the United Nations, in which all nations, regardless of, you know, whatever government they may have had, would be a part of this thing. And the idea was, we don't want any more wars. We want to stop this stuff by having a place where people could go and begin to talk and to work out their differences. This, you know, the same organization that Biden is trying to get, you know, Russia thrown out of, as everything else. I mean, they're trying to throw Russia out of every organization possible. But that was the policy of Roosevelt, and but Roosevelt was a unique individual. And he had been, you know, educated under the policies of Alexander Hamilton. His great-grandfather had been working with Alexander Hamilton in New York, and he was a well-read man, and he didn't like the British. We had this alliance of necessity with the British during World War II. But he was aware of what they were all about, and when Churchill, you know, came to visit him in December 1941. Everybody else was also worried. I mean, George Marshall and these other guys, you know, Churchill was at the White House. He was, you know, he used the bathtubs and he was living there and everything like that. And they were worried that FDR is going to cut a deal with this raving imperialist. But there was no danger to that because he knew what he was doing, and he knew that, you know, that this relationship would be necessary in order to prevent the takeover of all of Europe by the Nazis. But it was only a working arrangement. And after the war, he made it a point not to have any kind of condominium only with Churchill. And he went to these meetings, and many of these meetings, Churchill always wanted to, when they were meeting with Stalin, and in one of the meetings, they also had the Chiang Kai-shek, because Roosevelt looked at Asia. He knew about it. He was acquainted with it. He had all his own relatives who had been in the so-called China trade, so he was interested in this, and he felt that in Asia, China was going to become a major power and should become a major power. So they should be in this alliance as major powers. And Churchill didn't like that. And every time that they would meet, you know, Churchill always tried to talk to Roosevelt before they got together with Stalin so that they could plan up. And Roosevelt ignored him. You know, he avoided him because he didn't want to create the impression with Stalin that they were ganging up on him because he didn't want that kind of relationship. And had he lived, it probably would have gone much differently than anybody thought. You know, Lynn used to say, you know, in terms of this fight, is going against the pricks, is what he'd say. And there are a variety of ways of thinking of this. You know, but FDR did that too with regard to this Anglophile tradition. And it probably wasn't as strong. It was there, but it probably wasn't as strong as it is today in terms of the American elites. And people like Marshall, you know, and other leading figures, of course, they were very skeptical of the British with regard to that. But when the Cold War came, when Roosevelt died, and the Cold War came, and Churchill really took over, you know, from Harry Truman. He learned at the feet of Winston Churchill, who had become, you know, famous with his Fulton speech. And we went into the Cold War, and it went as it did. And Mackinder, of course, was revived. And foreign affairs, he was still alive during the war. In 1943, he wrote something for Foreign Affairs, which was pretty much along the same lines, in terms of the heartland, how you want to create that as a bulwark against, this time, the Bolshevik danger in particular, but also against Germany again. And his works then were studied, and there was a lot of discussion going on. So it was the proper moment, for reviving him again. But there were all kinds of tendencies in the United States which wasn't, imperialist-minded, and you had people who thought in terms of the American tradition, in terms of the notion of the equality of nations. So you had with Kennedy, you had a shift there. He wasn't, unlike Joe Biden, he didn't say that we have to, it's the authoritarian democracies against the so-called autocratic countries. He said we're going to extend the hand to Russia, to the Soviet Union. We're going to figure out a way of working together with them along common interests, like, for instance, in the space program, which he also proposed that they should work together. Khrushchev just didn't want to do that because he felt that Russia had an advantage in rockets over the United States, which they did at that time. But this was the idea of Kennedy. You can't make war against these major powers. You've got to find a way of working together with them. And then, of course, also with China. The last press conference he had before he was killed, he was asked a question, what about Red China? He says, in my second presidency, or with time, he says, I'm sure we're going to find a way of working together, of approaching and working together with Red China. And he said that also to his to the ambassador to India, what's his name, famous economist. I got a senior moment here.
Galbraith?
Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith. He said, I want to do it, but I have to wait until my second administration because it's going to raise hell, and if I do it before that, I may not get reelected. So that was what he wanted to do. Then you have it also with Reagan. I mean, Reagan, he talked about the evil empire, and he said all these things, but, he listened, he followed Lynn's lead on this, on the SDI. He was also, importantly, interested in trying to create some kind of dialogue with the Soviet Union, even before Gorbachev, and when there was these friendly meetings in Reykjavik, he also wanted to do that. And, Jack Matlock has in his book a quote from Reagan where Reagan said, if the Soviet Union were really working to help and to raise their people, he says, I would be happy to work with them, regardless of what system they had. I mean, could you imagine Biden today saying that with regard to China? I mean, how can you say they're not working? What, the poverty alleviation, the creation of tremendous economic development, jobs and scientific advances? He would never say that. I mean, so you do have this tradition, and of course, most importantly, this is what Lynn appealed to in the United States population, and even in the political elites, that he was determined. He saw from the get-go that the real problem in the United States is not really America itself. It is the British angle, the British influence over our thinking, which has become, a threat and a hindrance to developing proper policies for the United States itself. And this was really his strength, and the strength of his attraction is that there were people here, and there are people here, who understand this British problem. And it really was because of that that he was also targeted, because of the strength of the British. In fact, we know that this was the case because, we used to have an intelligence function that was much more extensive than really what we have today. And we do a good job here, but we had, all kinds of wild things going on. And we would talk to a lot of our enemies. And we would talk to our enemies because they would, say certain things. You had one of a guy that I know, probably don't remember him, but he was in New York, and he struck up a relationship with Big Brzezinski. I don't think Brzezinski really knew who he was, but Perry was friendly with him, and he would spill the beans on a lot of stuff that he was doing that was not in the public domain, and this was, of course, very valuable. And what also happened is that on the British side, we had these connections as well. And one of very high-level gentleman named de Courcy, it's a French name, but of course the Normans, remember that was all the French, it is the British establishment. He said to him, when Lynn was going to trial and was having, they were trying to bring everything down on him, he said, well, if Larouche would reject, would get away from this anti-British stuff, he would have a good career in the American establishment. And given who this guy was, I'm sure he was saying something pretty accurate, that if Lynn would shut up about the British problem, he'd have a role to play in the political structure. I mean, look, at the time people don't know that, but he was really advising the president. People were looking to us, as one of the major think tanks in the country because of the success of the SDI, because everybody knew that this was really our baby. But Lynn rejected this. And he had to reject it. He refused to do that. And people who knew him, who saw him, who didn't know him so well, realized that this is really, a sign of greatness, of great conviction, where you can go through hell or be prepared to go through hell because, you stand for something that you know is true. And that's what Lynn did. But it was this issue specifically, that he was touching the third rail in so-called U.S. politics. The third rail is the British angle, and that has always been, it's got to be destroyed because, as long as it's there, it's going to control everything. And what I'll say on this is the same kind of thing is happening today. Look, looking at through some of the material that's being written on China and on Russia, and you'll always see this Mackinder connection. And in Mackinder, of course, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was the problem, and you have even people writing, who saw an article the other day, said the BRI, this is what Mackinder was worried about. These kind of connections which connect Eurasia by land, which, makes it impossible for us, the Americans, i.e. the British, to keep control of. So this is what we're fighting. This is the sickness, this is the cancer in American intellectual life that really has got to be rooted out. And believe me, it's in the world as a whole, it's easier to do. I mean, you see what we're pulling together with the conference, the upcoming conference, and what we have done is in most of the world they realize that this is the case. That what the United States is doing, they don't all understand the British angle as the dominant, but they understand it in some sense as the Anglo-American problem, and they're with us on this. In the developing world, in Latin America. Even in India, look, British have been playing with them a long time on this Quad stuff, and they got a problem because they were controlled by the British so long, and the British never left them anything. I mean, did they build railroads? Did they construct atomic energy plants? Did they do any of this stuff, except keep these guys subservient? No, they didn't. They did leave the civil service, and there's a certain, problem with that in the way the Indians sometimes see the world. But they also realized what the reality of the British Empire was, and they're not prepared to deal with this, and that's why they have not gone along with these sanctions against Russia for that and for a lot of other reasons. They have good relations with Russia economically, militarily also, but there's also, they don't want to be, I think, a patsy for the Brits because they know what the Brits are. And they got problems with China, but they're working with it. And now tomorrow, Lavrov, who is persona non grata in the United States, and they're trying to make him persona non grata in every country in the world. He's going to India. He's going to have some talks from Afghanistan, which is a major, issue for India. They were not at this meeting, but they're certainly looking closely at what's going on because they would like to have stability and they would like to limit the terrorism in Afghanistan. And so that they're interested in that, and Lavrov is going to be talking to them. So in the rest of the world, it's much easier to figure it out. It's right here in the United States that it's extremely important. So the mobilization around this idea of the new security architecture is really the kind of thing that can break the back of the British game plan. Because all of these things have been created from the Paris Peace Conference to NATO and the games that are being played with Ukraine, which have been played with Ukraine since really 1919 by the British, are still going on. But to the extent that you can get the idea of this new security architecture in which the four major powers, India, Russia, the United States, and China, can play a role, can all be secured, be assured of their own security, and we can get other countries involved in this. It's a whole new ball game. It's back to the point of what Roosevelt wanted to accomplish earlier, but really at a higher stage because it's connected, to major economic development policy, scientific development. All of this stuff now has gone way beyond anything that we had in those days, and it can be a very interesting and important future for all of humanity. And for the third world, for the developing countries, it is the only way. What Biden is doing now, as several people have already said, with these sanctions, and it's sanctions upon sanction upon sanction, and Zelensky is saying, more sanctions, more sanctions, more sanctions. They're all insane, because what it's going to lead to is not only a destruction of the economies of Europe and the United States, but in the developing sector, it will lead, some people say, 1 billion people on the verge are starving. And this is absolutely unacceptable. So that this is the brunt of the task is mobilizing for this thing, and in order to not only get people together, but to break through this ideology, to break the bounds of this ideology, and to bring in the people. And there are people out there. I'm sure we just got to look for them. We got to shake the trees and see what we can get in, especially among the younger people now. Because, they're kind of looking around and say, hey, what's this all about in this crazy world? And we provide answers to them. And that bodes well for the future. So this is important mobilization. And that's really what I wanted to say now. But if you have any questions, that's fine.